The recording studio fell silent after the final note. Two voices, one gravelly and warm like aged whiskey, the other pure and crystalline like mountain water, had just finished singing together for the first time. The engineers in the booth sat motionless, afraid that speaking would break whatever spell had just been cast. Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald stood on opposite sides of the microphone, both breathing heavily, both looking at each other with something that hadn't been there an hour before. Respect, yes, but more than that, recognition. The kind that comes when two people who thought they were completely different suddenly realize they've been speaking the same language all along, just with different accents. What happened in that studio would create one of the most legendary partnerships in music history, but getting to that moment required both of them to surrender something they'd been holding on to for years: pride, territory, the belief that their way was the only way. And the story of how they got there, how two legends learned to share the spotlight instead of fighting for it, reveals something profound about what happens when ego steps aside and lets the music lead. New York City, 1946. The jazz world was changing rapidly, fragmenting into schools and styles that often seemed at war with each other. Traditional jazz versus bebop, swing versus experimental, the old guard versus the new generation. And in the middle of this cultural battlefield stood two titans who represented different eras, different sounds, different approaches to the same art form. Louis Armstrong, at 45, was already a living legend, the man who had practically invented jazz trumpet, whose innovations in the 1920s and 30s had created the foundation every other musician built on. But by 1946, some critics were calling him old-fashioned, a relic, someone whose time had passed. The young bebop players spoke about him with a mixture of respect and dismissal, acknowledging his historical importance while suggesting the music had moved beyond what he represented. Ella Fitzgerald, at 29, was the future. Young, brilliant, with a voice that could do things no one had ever heard before, scat singing that rivaled any horn player's improvisations, perfect pitch that made complex arrangements sound effortless. She represented the modern sound, the evolution, the place just was heading rather than where it had been. She had fans who had never listened to Louis Armstrong, who thought his style was too rough, too theatrical, too tied to an era they were trying to move past, and Ella herself, while she would never say it publicly, had absorbed some of that attitude. She saw Louis as a pioneer, certainly, someone to be respected for what he'd accomplished, but not someone she needed to collaborate with, not someone who could teach her anything about the music she was already mastering. They had crossed paths before, of course. The jazz world in the 1940s was smaller than people realized, and you couldn't be at Louis' level or Ella's without attending the same parties, the same benefits, the same late-night jam sessions where musicians gathered after their official gigs ended. But they had never really connected. Louis would nod at her across a room. Ella would smile politely back, and that was it. No conversation about music, no sharing of techniques or ideas, just two stars orbiting in the same galaxy but never quite coming into alignment. The distance wasn't hostile exactly. It was just the natural separation that exists between people who assume they have nothing to learn from each other. But Norman Granz had other plans. Granz was a producer and impresario who believed in breaking down the artificial barriers that kept great artists separated. He looked at Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald and saw something the rest of the jazz world was missing. Not competition, not old versus new, but complementarity, two different approaches to the same emotional truth. He believed that if he could get them in a studio together, if he could create the conditions for them to actually listen to each other instead of just coexist, something extraordinary might happen. The challenge was convincing them both that it was worth trying. Ella was skeptical when Granz first proposed the collaboration. "What would we even sing together?" she asked, her tone polite but doubtful. "We have completely different styles. I don't think our voices would work together." What she didn't say, but Granz could hear underneath her words, was the fear that Louis' rougher, more theatrical approach would overshadow her technical precision, that audiences would focus on his personality and miss her artistry, that collaborating with him might make her seem less modern, less relevant to the young audiences she was building. Louis had different concerns when Granz approached him. "Ella Fitzgerald is extraordinary," he said, and he meant it. "But she doesn't need me. She's got her own thing going, and it's beautiful. Why would she want some old cat like me singing on her records?" Underneath that self-deprecating humor was a genuine insecurity that Louis rarely showed. He could read the cultural shift happening around him. He knew the critics were calling him outdated. He worried that collaborating with Ella might expose the gap between where jazz had been and where it was going, and he might end up looking like exactly what the critics said he was. A legend, yes, but a relic. Norman Granz was patient and strategic. He didn't push, he didn't argue. He just created opportunities for Louis and Ella to be in the same spaces, listening to the same music, talking to the same musicians. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, their resistance began to soften. Not because Grants convinced them they were wrong, but because they started hearing each other differently. Ella attended a Louis Armstrong concert in Chicago and found herself moved by something she hadn't expected. Not his technical brilliance, which she already knew about, but his emotional generosity. The way he gave everything to the audience, held nothing back, made every person in that room feel like the music was being performed specifically for them. That wasn't outdated, that was timeless. Louis heard Ella sing at a late-night session and realized something he'd been too proud to admit before. Her technical perfection wasn't cold or mechanical like he'd assumed. It was a different kind of emotional expression. Where he used roughness and rasp to convey feeling, she used absolute precision, every note placed exactly where it needed to be to create maximum impact. It was like watching a master surgeon versus a master sculptor. Different tools, different techniques, but the same commitment to getting it exactly right. The first rehearsal was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in January 1947. Studio B at a Midtown Manhattan recording facility. Just the two of them, a piano player for reference and Norman Granz sitting quietly in the corner. The song Granz had chosen was Cheek to Cheek, the Irving Berlin standard that had been performed hundreds of times by dozens of artists. Safe territory, nothing too risky for a first collaboration. Louis arrived early, warming up in the hallway, running through scales and valve exercises. When Ella walked in, they shook hands formally, professionally, like colleagues about to work on a business transaction rather than create art together. The first run-through was technically perfect and emotionally empty. Ella sang her parts with flawless precision. Louis delivered his with characteristic warmth, but they weren't singing. Together, they were singing in the same room at the same time, which is a completely different thing. When they finished, there was polite applause from the few people in the studio, but everyone could feel it. This wasn't what they'd hoped for. This was two great artists being careful, protecting their territory, making sure neither overshadowed the other. And in trying so hard not to step on each other's toes, they'd created something bland and forgettable. Norman Granz called a break. Louis and Ella stood on opposite sides of the studio, both clearly frustrated but too professional to show it openly. The piano player, sensing the tension, excused himself for a cigarette, and that's when something unexpected happened. Louis, who had spent the entire first take being careful and restrained, suddenly started playing around with the melody on trumpet, not the official arrangement, just improvising, testing ideas, letting the music move where it wanted to go. It was playful, loose, the sound of someone remembering why they fell in love with music in the first place. Ella, standing across the room, found herself humming along with his improvisation, not consciously deciding to join in, just responding instinctively to what she was hearing. Her voice found harmonies Louis hadn't planned, created call-and-response patterns that surprised both of them. And suddenly they weren't on opposite sides of the studio anymore. They had drifted toward each other, toward the microphone, both caught up in something that felt more like a conversation than a performance. The melody of Cheek to Cheek was still there, but now it was alive, dancing, moving between them like a thing with its own consciousness. When they finished the improvised section, both stopped abruptly and looked at each other. Really looked at each other for the first time. Louis was grinning, that famous smile breaking across his face. Now that, he said, that felt like something. Ella laughed, a genuine sound of delight and surprise. Can we do that again? She asked. But this time, don't tell me what you're going to do. Just do it and I'll follow. Louis nodded. Only if you promise to surprise me too. I don't want to know what's coming. I want to discover it. They recorded Cheek to Cheek 6 more times that afternoon. Each take was different. Each one featured moments where one of them would take an unexpected turn and the other would have to respond in real time. No safety net, no predetermined arrangement to fall back on. And with each take, something remarkable happened. The distance between them disappeared, not just professionally but personally. They started joking between takes, suggesting ideas to each other, listening not just to respond but to understand. The young future and the legendary past were finding common ground in the only place that mattered. the music itself. The take they eventually chose for the record wasn't the most technically perfect. Ella's pitch wavered slightly on one note. Louis's timing pushed ahead of the beat in one section, but it had something none of the perfect takes had: chemistry, the sound of two people genuinely connecting, genuinely excited by what they were creating together. You could hear it in the way their voices intertwined, the way Louis's rasp complemented Ella's clarity instead of competing with it, the way they both seemed to be smiling through the entire performance. When the session ended, Louis and Ella sat in the studio for another hour just talking about music, about the pressure of expectations, about the loneliness of being at the top of your field with nobody who truly understands what that's like. Louis told her about the early days when he was revolutionizing jazz and terrified that he was doing it wrong, that critics would reject his innovations. Ella told him about the constant anxiety of trying to prove she belonged, that her success wasn't just luck or timing but genuine talent and endless work. And in sharing their vulnerabilities, they realized something powerful. They weren't competitors, they were allies, two people fighting the same battle from different positions. That first session led to more. Over the next decade, Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald would record 3 full albums together, dozens of individual tracks, and perform countless live duets that audiences still talk about 70 years later. But the music they created together was only part of the story. The real legacy was the relationship itself. The way two artists from different generations, different backgrounds, different approaches, learned to not just coexist, but to genuinely elevate each other. Ella would later say that working with Louis taught her that technical perfection wasn't enough, that the rough edges, the imperfections, the moments where emotion overrode technique, those were often where the real truth lived. She started taking more risks in her performances, allowing herself to be messy when the song demanded it, trusting that her audience would connect with honesty more than flawlessness, and Louis would say that Ella reminded him that discipline mattered, that the young musicians who were pushing jazz into new territories weren't rejecting what he'd built. They were building on it, and if he wanted to remain relevant, he needed to listen to where they were taking the music instead of dismissing it as wrong just because it was different. Their friendship became legendary in the jazz community, not the superficial kind of friendship that exists for publicity and photo opportunities, but the real kind where they'd call each other late at night to talk through a difficult arrangement, where they'd show up at each other's concerts just to listen, where they'd defend each other fiercely when critics tried to diminish either one's contributions. Ella started calling Louis Pops, a nickname that started as a joke about their age difference but became a term of genuine affection. Louis called Ella Lady, spoken with a reverence that made clear he considered her royalty. The cultural impact of their partnership extended beyond just the music they created together. In an era where jazz was fragmenting into hostile camps, where musicians were expected to choose sides between traditional and modern, their collaboration proved that those divisions were artificial. That great art could honor the past while embracing the future. That respecting your elders didn't mean staying stuck in their era, and that embracing innovation didn't mean abandoning everything that came before. They became living proof that the best way forward was through synthesis, not separation. There's a recording from 1956, one of their live performances, where you can hear this dynamic perfectly. They're singing "Dream a Little Dream of Me," and through, Louis starts improvising a trumpet solo that goes in a completely unexpected direction. For just a second, you can hear Ella hesitate. She doesn't know where he's going. The arrangement they rehearsed didn't include this section. She has a choice. She can stick to the plan, sing her next verse as written and let his solo stand alone. Or she can trust him, follow where he's leading and see what happens. She chooses trust. Her voice comes back in, not singing the lyrics but scatting, improvising alongside his trumpet, their two instruments, horn and voice, having a conversation that neither planned but both understand perfectly. The audience erupts, not just because it sounds beautiful, though it does, but because they're witnessing something rare and precious. Two masters who trust each other enough to be vulnerable to risk failure in front of thousands of people, to choose connection over safety. That moment, captured on a crackling recording, is worth more than 100 technically perfect performances, because it's alive, it's human, it's two people showing everyone watching that collaboration isn't about compromise or competition, it's about multiplication. When you bring your full self to a partnership and allow someone else to do the same, you don't divide the spotlight, you create more light. Louis Armstrong died in 1971. The night Ella Fitzgerald heard the news, she was scheduled to perform at the Hollywood Bowl. Her manager suggested canceling. "I understand if you can't go on," he said gently. Ella considered it, but then she thought about what Louis would say. He'd never missed a show unless he was literally unable to stand. The music mattered too much, the audience mattered too much, so Ella performed that night. And at the end of the concert, she sang Cheek to Cheek alone. No accompaniment, just her voice carrying both parts, hers and Louis's, honoring the man who had taught her that sharing the stage made you bigger, not smaller. Ella Fitzgerald continued performing for another 2 decades, but she never recorded Cheek to Cheek again after Louis died. That song belonged to both of them, and performing it without him felt wrong, incomplete. When journalists asked her about their partnership, she would always say the same thing. "Louis taught me that music isn't about proving you're the best. It's about giving everything you have to the moment, to the song, to the people listening. He taught me that generosity is strength, not weakness." Today, the recordings of Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald singing together remain some of the most beloved in jazz history. New generations discover them and marvel at the chemistry, the joy, the obvious affection between two people who could have been rivals but chose to be partners instead. Music students study their duets to learn about harmony, about rhythm, about the technical aspects of collaboration. But what they're really learning, whether they know it or not, is something more fundamental. They're learning that the best things we create are almost never created alone, that bringing your full authentic self to a collaboration doesn't mean losing yourself. It means finding parts of yourself you didn't know existed until someone else's artistry reflected them back to you. What Ella Fitzgerald heard that night in the studio, during that first improvised run-through of Cheek to Cheek, was the sound of possibility, the sound of what happens when you stop protecting your territory and start exploring shared ground, the sound of two people who thought they had nothing to learn from each other discovering they had everything to learn. And in learning from Louis Armstrong, in allowing his rough warmth to blend with her crystalline precision, Ella didn't become less herself. She became more complete, more courageous, more willing to take risks and trust that the music would catch her. That's the real legacy of their partnership. Not just the beautiful recordings, though those matter. Not just the sold-out concerts, though those brought joy to millions. The real legacy is the reminder that greatness doesn't require isolation, that you can be legendary and still have peers, that the most powerful thing an artist can do isn't dominate the spotlight but share it with someone equally brilliant and watch what emerges from that meeting of equals. Two voices, one gravelly and warm, one pure and crystalline, coming together to create something neither could have made alone. That's what Ella Fitzgerald heard that night, and she spent the rest of her life honoring it, embodying it, proving that the lesson Louis taught her wasn't just about music. It was about being human. About recognizing that our differences aren't obstacles to overcome. They're the very thing that makes collaboration valuable. They're what we bring to the table when we're brave enough to sit down together and create something new.